Hello everyone, welcome to BHP Live, our online shareholder question and answer session. I'm James Agar and today I'm joined by BHP's Chief Executive Officer, Andrew Mackenzie. Welcome, Andrew.
Great to be here, James. Looking forward to the questions.
Excellent. This is our third BHP Live session this year. Our shareholders have told us they like this forum, they like the opportunity to ask questions of BHP's key decision makers. We've had a number of you submit questions online before the session, so thank you for those. We also have the opportunity for you to ask questions during the session, and if you'd like to do that, could you please click the Ask a Question link on the top right corner of your screen. As I mentioned, we have had a number of questions come through. Unfortunately, we're unlikely to get through all of them, but we'll do our best over the next 30 minutes. Andrew, before we get started, you've had a busy few weeks. You're in London recently, meeting with our shareholders there as part of the PLC AGM. In your discussions with them, how would you describe the biggest wins for you and for BHP in 2018?
Look, it was a good set of results, and I think what I was most pleased about, and I think most of the people I spoke with as well, was the strength of our cash generation. We had a free cash flow for the year north of $12 billion, and that was exactly the same the previous year. So we're now very much on a track of throwing off about $1 billion of free cash flow every month. And the reality of that is that while we've been generating that free cash flow, we've still been able to invest significantly in growing our business and in paying down debt. And so that our debt is now at the bottom end of the range that we think we should sit in to have an efficient balance sheet, which means we don't really need to divert much more of that free cash flow towards the balance sheet. It's now almost entirely available to be paid as a cash return to shareholders. And I think that would be the highlight of the kind of cash generating capacity that we've created within BHP that I would take away from my time in London.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Andrew. We've had a number of very timely questions, I would say, come through on our intentions for the proceeds of the shale transaction. Last night we announced the completion of the shale exit, and this morning we followed up with an announcement in terms of our intentions for the proceeds of those transactions. How would you summarise today's announcement, Andrew?
Well, job well done. We committed to get on with selling our shale business, and we've moved very quickly, I think, to realise it for a decent sum of money. In aggregate now $10.4 billion, and we've made the decision that we're going to return all of that cash to shareholders, and we're going to split it equally between a special dividend and a buyback off market of limited shares. Maybe just say something about the buyback, because that's maybe not something that all shareholders are familiar with. Because it's off market and with the limited on the limited shares, we're able to buy back at a discount, and that discount reflects the value of the franking credit that can be attached to, if you like, or given as well as the cash to the shareholders who actually sell their shares back to us. Of course, that's a good thing for the shareholders who want the franking credits, but it's a good thing for all shareholders. First, because we are, through the discount, receiving value for those franking credits, which of course sit currently with the company, and effectively distributing that to all shareholders. And the other thing, of course, with a buyback, of course, it reduces the number of shares. And by reducing the number of shares, it means that all this free cash flow I spoke about, and therefore the dividends and the value that we are creating, is now going to be spread over a smaller number of shares. The EPS, all other things being equal, that's the earnings per share, will increase. And so that's a great deal for all shareholders.
Excellent. There are a number of key dates, Andrew, for the off-market buyback that we announced today, including today in relation to entitlement to those franking credits that you mentioned. All of the dates and the details are on the BHP website. That's bhp.com/buyback 2018. I please encourage you all to check those details. Before we move on, Andrew, the significant component of these returns, you mentioned the special dividend. Any comments you'd like to make on that?
Not much to say, but maybe just add to your dates and your calendar as well. The board will determine the absolute amount of the special dividend on the 17th of December, and it will be paid on the 30th of January.
Excellent. Okay, well, we'll change gears now, Andrew. We'll go to some more questions that we've received. This one comes from Margaret in Melbourne, and she asked, does BHP have a moral obligation to tackle climate change? And is the board willing to relinquish some of our future profits to safeguard the environment?
Well, Margaret, yes, we have a moral obligation to combat climate change, but we don't have to relinquish any of our profits because we think that mitigating climate change is good business for BHP. So kind of let me explain. We've designed our portfolio so that we can shift the makeup of our products as society shifts its expectations towards a lower carbon and probably more electricity intense source of energy going forward. And by moving that way, we can maintain the opportunities to invest for our company, but also maintain the profitability, whilst at the same time allowing the world to actually continue to grow and for populations to grow, but without growing and in many ways reversing the trend on the emissions of CO2. But of course, that all very much starts back with us. The first thing we must do is to make sure that our operations are as decarbonized as we can make them. And we have a target for the next 5 years to keep our carbon emissions flat, even though we'll be growing our production. And to be honest, we've been having a target like that since 2006. And since then, we've actually seen our carbon emissions drift down slightly, but we've produced an awful lot more material so that our BHP product today is probably at half the carbon intensity it would have been back in 2006. But we want to go further than that. And so we've also set a long-term goal that by 2050 we'll be carbon neutral, which means that we'll continue, I think, to grow the production of BHP. But by 2050, that will come at no net carbon emissions. So through the use of more renewable or less carbon intense sources of power for operations, greater support for things like reforestation and the preservation of wilderness, and just making everything much more efficient, we will be able to produce all the iron ore, the coal, copper, and the oil and gas, and some that we produce today, but in a net basis will not be emitting any additional molecule of CO2 into the atmosphere from 2050 onwards.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, we've had a number of questions on related themes. I'll ask one here from Karen, also from Melbourne. She wants to know if we plan to move away from coal mining to reduce our carbon emission footprint. And Daryl, again from Melbourne, would like to know how we're positioning the portfolio to benefit from batteries and electric vehicles.
Well, we're not going to move away from coal mining, but it's important that we understand that at BHP, the majority of the coal that we mine is metallurgical coal, and there is no real alternative to metallurgical coal for the manufacture of steel, and indeed, the creation of a number of critical metals from ore bodies that the world needs to go about its business. But we do have a substantial energy coal business. We have reduced that slightly. Recently, we sold out of our position in North America and we demerged our South African coal operations with South 32. We expect that the world will continue to use coal for its energy for many decades to come. And we believe that we can still profit from that by having very efficient coal operations on the energy sector. We've got some of the lowest cost operations in the world, one in New South Wales and one in Colombia. But at the same time, we do expect that coal will have less and less a share, if you like, of the total energy emissions within the world, and therefore we're going to be seeing a lot more growth in things like copper and possibly steel, which are critical to the electrification, the decarbonisation, and more renewables in the world. Sort of related to that is the question on batteries. We are actually very much part of the battery value chain through our nickel production in Western Australia. In fact, our nickel production in Western Australia is particularly suited to the types of nickel that you need to make the batteries, for example, for electric cars. And we've actually retooled our operation there so we can sell more and more into that, into that marketplace. But let me come back to metallurgical coal, because that's another part of what we have to do. You know, it emits just as much CO2 when it's used to make steel as burning a piece of coal in a power station does. And that, along with things like cement making and petrochemicals, is a very significant contribution to CO2, which is not related just to the energy sector. And the only solution to that is carbon capture and storage. And we at BHP have made the choice to be a leader in the development and the nurturing of carbon capture and storage technology, primarily to deal with what we think is our footprint, or our customers' footprint, in things like steel making. But of course, if that comes off, you know, it will further help mitigate the continuing, albeit lesser, use of coal as we go forward. And that's important because for many countries in the world, coal is still their cheapest source of energy, their most reliable source of energy. And to deny them that right away would run the risk of actually plunging them into poverty, or preventing them from ever lifting themselves out of poverty, or even getting onto the grid.
Right, thanks Andrew. Well, another timely question that's come in here from John in Doncaster East. John says, I'm interested to understand why BHP spends so much of shareholder funds on advertising. We see think big adverts constantly on TV, in print media and on radio. BHP doesn't sell commercial products or services, so what's the point?
Well, first of all, let's keep it in proportion, John. The reality is that the amount that we spend on the think big adverts that are constantly on TV, as you put it, is trivial. It's we count every penny, of course, or every cent, but it's only a few million, which is a relatively small amount of money for BHP and would represent a very minor project. But we do it primarily because we do want to stick up for the role that BHP has in society and the contribution that BHP makes to the world. And the importance of doing that is that if we don't say that, then we run the risk of unfavorable regulation, possibly tax regimes, unfair relative to other sectors, where people seem to think that it's not as critical that we have a flourishing and successful resources business to provide the basic needs of the world. Most manufacturing starts with digging things up. And if you don't do that, then you have nothing to make your materials with. So people need to be reminded of that. And that's what we've done with these ads very successfully. I think the understanding of that has jumped immeasurably as we've followed the surveys through these campaigns. You know, and they're pretty good ads. And the only thing that, you know, that I might sort of regret about it is that my wife gets very fed up about the fact that whenever we go to the cinema and the ad's on, that I stand up to attention. But you know, I can't but be proud.
Okay, thanks Andrew. Well, next time you're at the movies and someone's blocking your view, it's most likely going to be the CEO of BHP. We're going to move on now to back to the portfolio, Andrew, back to copper again. You've spoken about that earlier, but Olympic Dam specifically. Ian from Fig Tree Pocket says, Olympic Dam issues are impacting copper production, such as last year's major shutdown and now the recent plant outage. How confident are you that there'll be no further surprises impacting copper production in South Australia?
Well, I'll first say to you, Ian, that the only surprise there, in my view, because it was a relatively modest late start back up from the shutdown, which I'll come back to, was the loss of the acid plant. That's something, of course, we regret, but we have fixed it, and as we speak, it's ramping back up to full capacity. Olympic Dam is a challenge for us, and it's a challenge that we're going to meet head on. It's the only business that we have that is now not offering substantial returns well into double digits. Now with shale gone, everything else in the portfolio is performing at what we think is a very respectable and high return basis. So given that's the only one, we're now able to really focus on it to make sure we can lift its game up to the level of the rest of the company. And we have to do that. I mean, it's a phenomenal ore body, very high grades, in a very favourable environment to invest. I'm talking about South Australia there, which is very business friendly, very mining friendly, and those grades tend not to decline with time. It's been built as an underground mine with a relatively complicated processing facility on top of it. If we did it again today, it would be much, much simpler, more in line with what we have, for example, at Escondida. But we are where we are, and so we have to make both the underground mine efficient and we have to make that processing plant work. So that's why we took the shutdown. Wasn't surprised. We made it clear we're going to have to shut it down for the better part of half a year in order to lift performance and lift the reliability of performance. And before we had the acid plant issue, it was actually producing some near record performances through the smelter and the refinery. The acid plant issue was very unfortunate because the Olympic Dam acid requires a lot of acid to run, and without that acid being produced as a byproduct of smelting, then we couldn't really run the whole operation. But that's now fixed, and I expect we'll get back to some of those near record performances pretty quickly. The other thing we have to accept is that for a long time, this asset was assumed it would move into an open pit. And that meant we really didn't invest enough in the underground mine that was going to be replaced. We've changed that all now. We don't think the open pit can work, and we have to now take the much more complicated, largest underground mine in Australia and make it even bigger, and to run with the precision that we would take for granted in an open pit. And when we do that, and we're on our way to do that, then it will be very expandable, and it will have a very important role to play. You've heard my comments about the importance of copper in renewables and so on, and in electric vehicles for many decades to come, and we're on it.
Thanks, Andrew. Very important business in South Australia, and again, I'll remind our shareholders we'll be in Adelaide next Thursday for the BHP Limited AGM. Andrew, we're going to change gears now. We've had several shareholders come in to ask questions about BHP's aspiration to achieve gender balance in its workforce. One of the questions submitted asks if this ambition will discriminate against men in the company. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely not. We've found that very strong evidence that when we have mixed, diverse teams, where we have strong representation of both men and women, that they outperform, if I could say it, less diverse and predominantly male teams. And so the first thing is that if you're a bloke in BHP and you're sitting in these teams, you're in teams that are more biased towards high performance. So that doesn't sound like discrimination to me. The reality is that in order to get to our gender balance, all we have to do is start now recruiting an almost equal number of men and women, and to keep them, so the retention rate should be similar. If we do that, then we're on a track to get to gender balance, and that, in my view, will be a much more acceptable company, given the way that society views gender balance right now and fairness between men and women. But it will also, in my view, be a higher performing company, because everything will be made up of these higher performing, diverse teams. So I think it's good news. It's good news for all men in BHP, and it's good news for BHP shareholders, and of course for BHP women.
Thanks, Andrew. Clearly a lot of passion there. We're going to change tack again now, back to commodities. We've spoken about copper, but Richard from Brisbane now has a question on potash. He wants to know if BHP will develop its mine in Canada.
Well, that's not been decided. It's an option. We're very pleased that we have this option because we see in a world going forward, that world is going to have to make its agriculture much more efficient. Many more mouths to feed who want to eat a better diet. One thing we can predict with confidence that the world's population is going to grow. But back to some of the discussions we had earlier, James, on CO2. One of the ways in which you can stay within 1.5 degrees, which is what the IPC is suggesting, is to substantially increase the rate with which we reforest, which means less land will be available for growing food. And that means that land has got to be much, much more efficient, which means you've got to make full use of all the macronutrients as well as potash. You've got to have nitrogen and phosphate, the micronutrients, pesticides, and so on and so forth, and the best sort of high-yielding grains, genetic modification. I could go on and on. But that's also important for the evolution of the world. As you go to more urbanization, which helps lift people out of poverty, you have to run your agricultural sector with fewer people more efficiently. And why we've chosen potash in all of that to make our contribution to the more efficient, more decarbonization feeding of a growing population in the world is that, unlike all these other things that I talked about, which tend to be made in the chemical industry, of course, as I said earlier, they have initial ingredients that come from the earth. What you dig up in terms of potash, it's potassium chloride, is what you put on the farmer's field. So this is a mining business, and one that we think we can be good at. It actually has a lot of parallels with petroleum as well, and so our portfolio of technologies is being used to sort of reinvent the way in which we might mine potash much more efficiently to help feed the world going forward. We've been very deliberate about creating this option. We've made acquisitions, we've had exploration success, and we believe we have our arms around the best undeveloped potash ore bodies in the world, which could, over time, and I'm talking a long time here, create a business of the scale of our iron ore business today. In a way, we're sitting around 1960 in iron ore terms right now in potash, but obviously we can foresee with what we've got and what we've created through the development of 2 shafts, the potential for it to be quite significant in the portfolio in many decades to come. The actual timing to market, and when we do that, of course, has to be hugely disciplined. We have to only develop when the market is ready for it, and we have to use all of the power of the very disciplined approach to capital allocation in BHP to make sure we get it right. So I remind you, it's an option. It's a compelling option for the reasons I've described. It could compete very powerfully for capital, but it must compete. And if it doesn't, then we'll delay the exercise of that option and think again.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. We've had a few questions come through on China. I've picked out a couple here. So first one is Martin from Como, who asks about Chinese demand and specifically wants to know if there will be any impact from the strict pollution controls that are now being imposed in China on our products.
Yes, but they're good. It's a good impact. I mean, China has decided that it wants to make steel and smelt copper with less environmental impact. And that means they require a higher quality of iron ore, a higher quality of metallurgical coal, and a higher quality of copper concentrate. We saw this coming, and so we have biased our investments within our ore bodies to produce the highest quality we can, which means a high iron content, a number of properties to do with primarily hardness around our metallurgical coal, and a high copper content and a low other impurity content in our concentrates. So as a result of that, and as a result of China doing that, we're enjoying big premiums for those products, which are adding significantly to the profitability of BHP.
Great. Sticking with China, Andrew, we've got Diana from Brighton. Obviously lots of news around trade restrictions, and she wants to know, are we concerned about the potential for trade restrictions affecting our ability to sell into China, and to what extent have alternative markets been developed by BHP?
Well, we are concerned more generally, I think, about the trade disagreements at the moment and the reimposition or the increase of a number of tariffs. Not so much because of what it might do in the short to medium term in China, but what it might do just generally to global growth. We believe it will suppress global growth if it catches on, and that's of course bad for the demand for the overall demand for BHP products. We sell everywhere in the world, and we're hugely determined by the health of the world economy. But we should remind ourselves as well, to those people who are engaged in these disputes, that actually without this growth, a lot more people will stay in poverty for a lot longer. And we really care about this. This is a very inhumane approach that's developed in the world that we will speak up strongly against. But I don't want to alarm you about the company. because in reality, we are not seeing any disruption to the trade flows of our products into our customers. And of course, the reality is what we worry about more is, but particularly as it relates to China, is, well, how much of those products are made into manufactured goods that then are re-exported and require those export markets that may be denied to them because of some of the craziness that's going on in the world right now. The answer is relatively few are dependent on, for example, exports to the US. And yes, China has worked to do something against that through its Belt and Road Initiative, and it's being really active right now in a number of international trade negotiations. It's finding different routes for those products. That's one way it's doing that, but it's also working very hard to counteract the impact of some of the trade tariffs through stimulating its own domestic demand, so that many of those products will be consumed within China or within some of the very benign trade environments that sit around it in Asia. And so we're anxious that something is not right in the world now because of that, and we therefore are looking forward with caution. But longer term, we would say there is an inexorable growth in demand for our products based on bigger populations seeking a higher standard of living. And we think that same pressure, when people are forced to pay higher costs for materials they want because of these trade tariffs, will force some of the politicians to come to their senses and reverse things, and therefore create the kind of rosy future I believe, and I talked about earlier, that we see for BHP.
Okay, Andrew, we're going to move now to Brazil. We've got a question here from David in Turac. He wanted to get an update on the legal proceedings and also the work going on the ground to repair the environment and compensate the community following the Samarco dam failure.
Yeah, well, it's going okay. I mean, obviously this was a terrible tragedy, and we've accepted, our responsibility for it and our accountability to clean up the mess that's been created about it and deal with both the environmental and humanitarian issues. And there are, of course, legal proceedings around that. Most of those legal proceedings result from the work of the public prosecutors in Brazil. And we have been able to sit around the table with them and work out a number of ways in which we can actually make the right reparations in the timely way that would actually satisfy what I think we should do morally, if you like, but obviously to satisfy some of the legal issues as well. This all takes time. But we have good agreement, and we've had good agreement as to how we take many of the initial steps. For example, the environmental cleanup is going pretty well. I visit regularly, and it's beginning to look much more normal relative to what it was. We've certainly secured all the remaining tailings that sit in the dam that is broken. We've worked very hard on a number of compensation schemes for those people whose water supplies were disrupted in the immediate aftermath of that, are people whose livelihoods have been disrupted, fishermen, for example, and a lot of compensation, has been paid. And then, of course, we have to resettle the people whose homes were lost as a result of this terrible disaster. And we've done well with it where we can rebuild in the existing area. However, there are 3 communities where we're going to have to rebuild in another area just to make them safer and to give them a new town. And that takes a bit more time to agree where that should be and to get all the permitting. But again, we're making good progress there as well. And we expect everybody to be fully resettled by 2020. And in the meantime, they're all provided in homes, and a lot of the children are in the same schools and the same classes as they would have been if they'd still been in their original village.
Okay, well, look, we're almost out of time, but I'd like you, Andrew, as the final question from where you sit as CEO of BHP. How would you describe the outlook for BHP shareholders? Well, I said earlier it was rosy, and I also say we're highly investable. And I just make two reasons for that. We have, through a lot of work, created something which I believe is the ideal portfolio for a company like BHP. The right commodities which demand the geological and engineering skills that we are best at. They're some of the best ore bodies on Earth, which predispose us to be very low cost.
but we're going to make ourselves even lower costs because we have an enormous campaign underway at the moment to up the capability of our people, so that they can make our operations perform with even greater efficiency, which means even lower costs and even better protection for the environment. We're a hugely investable company.
Okay, thanks. That's all we have time for today. Thanks again for joining us on our BHP Live session. I'd just like to summarise, there were some key dates there that we mentioned for shareholders. Obviously, the off-market buyback that we announced this morning. Today is an important date in the context of that announcement in relation to entitlement to those franking credits that Andrew spoke of. So please do get on the website and check all of those details on the BHP website. The special dividend that Andrew spoke of as well, that's a fully franked dividend, and that'll be paid on January the 30th. Next week we'll be in South Australia, as I mentioned, at the Adelaide AGM, so we look forward to seeing many of you there. And until next time, thanks for joining. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, James, and thanks for watching and giving us all these great questions.